The cantina was dark and smoky, filled with the bitter smell of fermented grain alcohol and the quiet chatter of off-duty soldiers. Kethvar sat hunched over his drink, his three eyes staring into the purple liquid as if it held answers to questions he wished he had never learned to ask. His scales, once a brilliant blue-green, had dulled with age and too many battles. Scars crossed his arms and neck like a map of pain. The young recruits sat around him in a circle, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. They had heard whispers about the Terran problem, about the war that had changed everything. But whispers were just words. They wanted to hear the truth from someone who had been there, someone who had survived. "Tell us about the humans," said Vexka, the youngest of the recruits. Her scales still gleamed with youth, unmarked by battle. "Tell us what they are really like." Kethvar lifted his head slowly. His eyes were tired, older than his years. He had seen things that no soldier should see, done things that haunted his dreams. But these young ones needed to know. They needed to understand what they might face if the peace ever broke. "The humans," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of shouting orders over the sound of weapons fire. "Where do I begin?" He took a long drink, feeling the alcohol burn down his throat. It helped sometimes to dull the memories. But they never went away completely. I was a squad leader then, young and stupid and full of glory dreams. The Dominion had just started the war, and we all thought it would be easy. The humans were new to space, barely out of their home system. They had small ships, simple weapons, and no real military tradition. At least, that is what our commanders told us. Kethvar paused, remembering the confidence they had all felt. The Zephyrian Dominion controlled half the galaxy. They had conquered dozens of worlds, absorbed countless species into their empire. One more primitive race should have been simple work. My first real battle with humans was on Kepler 442b. It was a mining world. Nothing special. Rocky, cold, with thin air that made breathing hard. About 50,000 humans lived there, mostly miners and their families. The plan was simple: land, secure the population, and move them to work camps. Standard procedure. The recruits leaned forward, eager to hear about their first great victory. But Kethvar's expression grew darker. "We came down in force. 3,000 soldiers. Heavy weapons. Air support. The humans had maybe 200 fighters, all of them poorly equipped. They should have surrendered immediately. Any civilized species would have." He took another drink, his hands shaking slightly. "But humans are not civilized, not the way we understand it." The first sign of trouble had come at the spaceport. The Zephyrian dropships had landed without resistance, which should have been good news. But as Kethvar's squad moved through the empty terminal, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too careful. "Where are they?" his second-in-command had asked. Kethvar had been wondering the same thing. Intelligence reports said the humans would try to evacuate civilians through the spaceport, but the landing pads were empty, the buildings abandoned. Then the explosion started. They had turned the entire spaceport into a trap, Kethvar told the recruits. Hidden charges in the walls and the floors, in places we never thought to look. The first blast killed 12 of my soldiers instantly. The second brought down half the control tower. But that was just the beginning. As the Zephyrian forces tried to regroup, human fighters appeared from everywhere and nowhere. They came out of maintenance tunnels, dropped from ceiling vents, rose up from storm drains. They fought with a desperate fury that made no sense. "I remember the first human I saw up close," Kethvar said. His name was Jake Morrison, a Marine, lieutenant according to his uniform. He should have been retreating with the other defenders following standard military doctrine. Instead, he and his squad were moving toward our position. Morrison's squad was badly outnumbered. Any rational commander would have pulled back, tried to find better ground or more support. But Morrison seemed to have a different plan entirely. They were buying time, Kethvar realized now, though it had taken him years to understand. The civilians were evacuating from the other side of the colony, and Morrison's job was to keep us busy long enough for them to escape. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Kethvar's military training. The humans fought without regard for their own safety. using tactics that seemed insane. A female soldier named Amy Fletcher had actually run toward a Zephyrian heavy walker, carrying explosive charges. She had died in the blast, but so had the walker and its crew. We could not understand it, Kethvar said. Why would she throw her life away like that? One soldier against a heavy walker makes no sense. But she was not thinking like a soldier. She was thinking like a human. Another fighter, Ben Hughes, had continued shooting even after losing his left arm to plasma fire. He had tied a tourniquet with his teeth and kept fighting with one hand until blood loss finally dropped him. Even then, he had tried to crawl toward the Zephyrian position. They used everything as a weapon. Kethvar continued. Mining equipment became bombs. Construction vehicles became battering rams. They turned their own infrastructure against us. The humans had rigged the colony's power plant to overload, threatening to destroy everything within a 10-mile radius. They had poisoned the water supply rather than let it fall into enemy hands. They had programmed the automated systems to attack anything that moved. But the worst part was their complete lack of fear. Zephyrian military doctrine was based on the idea that intelligent beings wanted to survive. You could predict their actions, force them into surrender, negotiate with them, but humans seemed to have no survival instinct at all. Morrison held his position for 6 hours, Kethvar said. 6 hours against overwhelming odds. His squad was cut down one by one, but he never retreated. When we finally overran his position, we found him tied to a detonator. The human lieutenant had connected himself to the explosive charges under the colony's main power plant. If the Zephyrians tried to disarm the bombs, he would detonate them manually. It was a standoff that should have ended in negotiation. I tried to talk to him, Kethvar remembered. I told him we could make a deal, surrender, and we would treat him as a prisoner of war. Fight and everyone dies. Morrison had looked at him with eyes that showed no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. That is the point, the human had said. The explosion had destroyed the power plant, most of the colony, and half of Kethvar's battalion. Morrison had died instantly, but his sacrifice had given the civilian evacuation ships time to escape. By the time Zephyrian reinforcements arrived, the colony was empty except for the dead. We won the battle, Kethvar told the recruits. We took the planet, but we lost more soldiers in one day than in the previous 3 campaigns combined. And for what? An empty world full of booby traps and poisoned wells. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. This was not the glorious victory they had expected to hear about. That was my first lesson about humans, Kethvar said. They do not fight to win battles. They fight to make sure you lose the war. Every death, every sacrifice, every insane tactical decision serves a larger purpose. They turn warfare itself into a weapon. He finished his drink and stood up slowly, his joints aching with old wounds. Remember this when you face them. Humans are not trying to defeat you in battle. They are trying to make you afraid to fight them at all. And when you understand that difference, you will know true terror. The cantina fell quiet as Kethvar walked away, leaving the recruits to think about what they had heard. Outside, the night was dark and cold, but not as cold as the fear that had settled in their hearts. The recruits had barely recovered from Kethvar's first story when he returned to the cantina 3 nights later. Word had spread among the young soldiers, and now twice as many gathered around the old veteran's table. They came with notebooks and voice recorders, hoping to capture every detail of his experiences. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear, but all of them came because they needed to understand. Kethvar looked worse than before. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he poured his drink. The memories were getting stronger, not weaker, as he shared them. But the young ones needed to know, and he was perhaps the only one left who could tell them. "You want to hear more?" he said, not really asking. "You think the story of Kepler 482b was the worst of it?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. That was just the beginning. The real nightmare started at Titan Base. The recruits settled in, some taking notes, others just listening with wide eyes. Kethvar took a long drink and began his second tale. Titan Base had been the crown jewel of human defensive positions in the Saturn system. Built into the largest moon of the gas giant, it was supposed to be impregnable. The humans had spent decades carving tunnels and chambers deep into the ice and rock, creating a fortress that could withstand anything the galaxy could throw at it. Admiral Vextha commanded our fleet, Kethvar said. 300 ships, the largest force the Dominion had ever assembled. We surrounded the base completely. There was no way in or out. Standard siege protocol said the humans would surrender within 72 hours. He paused, remembering the confidence they had all felt. The human base was isolated, outnumbered, and had no hope of reinforcement. Any rational commander would have negotiated a surrender to save lives. Commander Lisa Parker was in charge of the base. We sent her the usual demands: surrender unconditionally, and your people would be treated according to galactic law. Refuse, and we would take the base by force. The response had come within an hour. 3 words that would haunt Kethvar for the rest of his life. Come and take it. What followed was 3 months of hell. The humans did not just defend their base. They turned the entire battle into a weapon against the Zephyrian fleet. The first surprise came on day 4, Kethvar continued. A human supply ship broke away from the base and headed straight for our command cruiser. We thought they were trying to escape, so we prepared to capture them. But the supply ship was not trying to escape. As it approached the Zephyrian vessel, it suddenly accelerated to ramming speed. The human crew had turned their own transport into a guided missile. The impact destroyed both ships, Kethvar said quietly. 300 Zephyrian crew members died instantly. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that the humans had loaded the ship with their own dead. The psychological impact was devastating. The humans were not just willing to die for their cause, they were willing to use their own corpses as weapons. It was a level of warfare that the Zephyrians had never encountered, but that was only the beginning. Engineer Tony Rodriguez had been working inside the base, modifying systems that were never meant to be weapons. He had rewired the life support systems to create chemical weapons, turning the air recycling plants into poison factories. When Zephyrian boarding parties finally breached the outer hull, they found entire sections filled with toxic gas. We lost 2 full companies to those traps, Kethvar remembered. They died choking on air that should have kept them alive. Rodriguez had turned the most basic necessity of life into a tool of death. The siege continued for weeks, with the humans finding new ways to weaponize everything around them. They flooded sections of their own base with radiation from the reactor cores, making those areas impossible to occupy. They turned maintenance robots into suicide bombers. They rigged the artificial gravity generators to create crushing forces that could flatten a soldier in seconds. Captain Greg Stone had led the most audacious attack of the siege. Using nothing but magnetic boots and stolen Zephyrian weapons, he and his team had somehow managed to board and capture a destroyer from the inside. They had crawled across the hull during a firefight, cut through the armor with mining lasers, and fought their way to the bridge. Stone then used our own ship against us, Kethvar said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and horror. He turned the destroyer's guns on Titan base itself, creating a debris field that destroyed 2 more of our vessels. The captured destroyer had been loaded with explosives and rammed into the base's outer defenses. The explosion had sent chunks of metal and ice flying in all directions, turning the battlefield into a deadly storm of shrapnel. We could not understand their strategy, Kethvar explained. They were destroying their own base, killing their own people just to hurt us. It made no tactical sense. But the humans were not thinking in terms of tactics. They were thinking in terms of total war. Every action was designed to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, regardless of the cost to themselves. The siege dragged on for 3 months. The Zephyrian fleet was slowly being worn down by constant attacks, booby traps, and psychological warfare. Ships were destroyed by ramming attacks, boarding parties were killed by poisoned air, and crew morale was collapsing under the stress of fighting an enemy that seemed to have no limits. By the end of the 2nd month, Admiral Vextha was ready to call for reinforcements, Kethvar said. We had lost over half our fleet and the humans showed no signs of weakening. If anything, they were getting more creative. The final assault was planned for the 90th day of the siege, Every remaining ship in the fleet would attack simultaneously, overwhelming the human defenses through sheer numbers. It should have worked. The humans were exhausted, running low on supplies, and had nowhere to retreat. But Commander Parker had one last surprise. Protocol Omega, Kethvar whispered. We still do not know exactly what it was, some kind of self-destruct system that turned the entire base into a fusion bomb. The humans had been preparing for this moment from the beginning. Every system, every reactor, every power source had been linked together in a massive explosive network. When Parker gave the final order, Titan Base became a miniature star. The explosion was visible from Jupiter, Kethvar said. It vaporized everything within 1,000 kilometers. The entire Zephyrian assault fleet was destroyed in seconds. 300 ships, 50,000 crew members, all gone in a flash of light. The recruits sat in stunned silence. The scale of destruction was beyond anything they could imagine. There were no human survivors, Kethvar continued. Parker and her people had chosen to die rather than surrender. They had turned their own deaths into the ultimate weapon. But the real horror was not just the destruction. It was the message the humans had sent to the galaxy. They were willing to sacrifice everything, including their own lives, to ensure their enemies paid a price too high to bear. The Dominion High Command called it a victory, Kethvar said bitterly. We had taken the base, after all. But at what cost? We had lost 3 full battle groups to capture a pile of radioactive debris. The strategic implications were staggering. If every human position required such a massive commitment of forces to capture, the war would bankrupt the Dominion. They could not afford to lose entire fleets for every minor victory. That was when we began to understand, Kethvar said. The humans were not trying to win battles. They were trying to make the war so expensive that we would give up. Every base, every ship, every soldier was a weapon in a larger strategy. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion and old wounds. They taught us that anything can be a weapon if you are willing to use it. Life support systems, gravity generators, their own bodies. Even their deaths became tools of war. The cantina was silent except for the soft hum of the air recyclers. The recruits stared at their drinks, trying to process what they had heard. Remember this, Kethvar said as he walked toward the door. When you fight humans, you are not just fighting soldiers. You are fighting a species that has learned to weaponize everything, including their own extinction. The door closed behind him, leaving the young soldiers alone with their fears and their growing understanding of what they might someday face. A week had passed since Kethvar's second story, but the cantina remained crowded with soldiers every night. Word had spread throughout the base about the old veterans' tales. Officers came to listen now, not just recruits. Some brought recording devices hoping to capture intelligence that might be useful. Others came simply because they could not believe what they were hearing. Kethvar sat in his usual corner, staring at the wall where propaganda posters promised glory and honor in service to the Dominion. The words seemed hollow now, meaningless, after what he had seen. He had not slept well in days. The memories were getting stronger, more vivid, as if telling them was bringing them back to life. You look tired, said Colonel Zexmar, settling into the chair across from him. The officer was older than the usual recruits, scarred from his own battles. Perhaps you should rest. Kethvar laughed bitterly. Rest comes after the telling. These young ones need to know what they might face. The colonel nodded. He had heard whispers about the human campaigns, about entire regiments that had simply vanished. The official reports blamed equipment failures and communication breakdowns, but the survivors told different stories. Tell me about New Virginia, Zexmar said quietly. The recruits fell silent. They had heard that name whispered in the corridors, always followed by nervous glances and quick changes of subject. New Virginia was where the Dominion had learned that humans could turn an entire planet into a weapon. Kethvar took a long drink, feeling the familiar burn of alcohol. It helped dull the sharp edges of memory, but it could not erase them completely. New Virginia was supposed to be the easy one, he began. A farming world, mostly agricultural settlements spread across 3 continents. 2 million humans. No military installations, no heavy industry. Just farmers and their families trying to make a living. The Dominion had assigned only one division to the conquest, expecting minimal resistance. The humans had no army, no navy, no air force. They grew food and shipped it to other worlds. What threat could they possibly pose? Colonel Sam Mitchell was the one who organized the resistance, Kethvar continued. He had been a corn farmer before the war, tending his fields and raising his children. He knew nothing about military tactics or strategy, but he understood his people and his land. The invasion had gone smoothly at first. Zephyrian forces landed at the major spaceports and secured the primary cities within hours. The local government surrendered immediately, and the occupation began according to standard procedures. But within days, strange things started happening. Supply convoys began disappearing. Not destroyed, not attacked, just gone. Entire truck columns would leave one base and never arrive at their destination. Search parties would find the vehicles abandoned, the supplies missing, the drivers nowhere to be found. At first we thought it was simple theft, Kethvar said. Humans taking what they needed to survive. But then we found the bodies. The missing drivers had been executed, their bodies left as warnings. But these were not random killings. The humans had chosen their targets carefully, always hitting the most valuable supplies, the most important routes. Mitchell had turned his entire population into a resistance network, Kethvar explained. Every farmer, every shopkeeper, every child old enough to carry a message. They fought a war we could not even see. The resistance used tactics that violated every convention of civilized warfare. They did not wear uniforms, did not follow military protocols, did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. Everyone was a potential enemy, and everyone was a potential target. Kate Williams had been a schoolteacher before the war. She had spent her days educating children, teaching them to read and write and think. But when the Zephyrians came, she had walked into a command post with a nuclear device strapped to her chest. The explosion had killed 50 soldiers and destroyed the entire facility. We could not understand it, Kethvar said. A teacher, someone whose job was to protect children, becoming a suicide bomber, it made no sense. But it made perfect sense to the humans. Williams had calculated that her death would save more lives than her survival. She had weighed the options and chosen the path that would inflict the most damage on the enemy. Dan Clark had been a mechanic, skilled at fixing the farming equipment that kept the colonies running, but he had turned that knowledge into a weapon, booby-trapping abandoned vehicles so effectively that Zephyrian forces stopped using any human technology entirely. Every truck, every car, every piece of machinery became a potential bomb, Kethvar remembered. Clark rigged them with such cunning that our engineers could not find the traps. We lost dozens of soldiers to exploding tractors and poisoned fuel lines. The humans fought a war of attrition that the Zephyrians could not match. They sacrificed their own cities rather than let them fall into enemy hands. They poisoned their own water supplies, burned their own crops, destroyed their own homes. They were willing to starve rather than feed their enemies, Kethvar said. They turned their own planet into a wasteland to deny us its resources. The psychological warfare was even worse than the physical attacks. The humans used their own children as weapons, teaching them to build bombs and plant them in areas where soldiers might rest. They used their elderly as suicide bombers, sending grandmothers with explosives to attack checkpoints. We could not tell who was dangerous and who was innocent, Kethvar said. A child playing in the street might be carrying a grenade. An old man sitting on his porch might be waiting for the perfect moment to detonate himself. The breaking point had come during what the humans called the Christmas Offensive. Nick Turner, a cell leader who had once managed a grain silo, had coordinated attacks across the entire planet during their religious holiday. Using winter storms as cover, resistance, fighters had infiltrated every major Zephyrian installation simultaneously. They did not try to hold territory, Kethvar said. They just wanted to kill as many of us as possible before dying themselves. It was not a military operation. It was a massacre. The attacks had been perfectly synchronized. As families across the planet celebrated their holiday, resistance fighters had struck at command centers, supply depots, communication arrays, and medical facilities. The humans had used their own festival as cover for the largest coordinated attack in the war. My base was hit by a dozen fighters, Kethvar remembered. They came through the storm like ghosts, killing guards, setting fires, destroying everything they could reach. Most of them died in the assault, but they accomplished their mission. The aftermath had been devastating. Entire Zephyrian regiments had been found dead at their posts, poisoned by their own air supplies. The humans had somehow weaponized the planet's atmosphere, turning the very air into a tool of death. Turner had been planning it for months, Kethvar said. He had identified every weakness in our defenses, every vulnerability in our systems. He had turned the planet's entire ecosystem against us. The Zephyrian forces had been forced to retreat to orbital stations, abandoning the surface entirely. But even there, they were not safe. The humans had launched crude rockets from the ground, filled with biological weapons that could survive in space. They taught their children to sing songs about killing aliens, Kethvar said. They made murdering us part of their culture, their religion, their very identity. The occupation had lasted 6 months. At the end, the Zephyrians controlled nothing but empty buildings and poisoned ground. The human population had been reduced to a fraction of its original size, but those who remained were more dangerous than ever. We declared victory, Kethvar said bitterly. We raised our flag over the capital city and claimed the planet for the Dominion. But what had we won? A dead world full of traps and hatred. The colonel leaned back in his chair, processing what he had heard. The official reports had mentioned heavy casualties on New Virginia, but nothing like this. How many did we lose, he asked. Officially? 12,000, Kethvar replied. Unofficially, no one knows. Soldiers just kept disappearing one by one, until whole units were gone. Some are probably still out there, buried in unmarked graves or dissolved in acid. The recruits sat in stunned silence. They had joined the military expecting to fight. Other soldiers, not entire populations, willing to die for their cause. The humans turned warfare into something we could not comprehend, Kethvar said. They made every civilian a soldier, every building a fortress, every meal a potential poison. They fought with their children, their elderly, their dying. They weaponized their own suffering. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. Remember this when you face them, he said. Humans do not fight wars. They fight extinctions. Every battle is a survival test, and they would rather destroy everything than lose. The cantina remained silent long after he left, the soldiers lost in their own thoughts about what they had learned. The cantina had changed over the past month. What had started as casual storytelling had become something else entirely. Senior officers now attended regularly, taking notes and recording every word. The stories of human warfare had spread beyond, the base reaching the highest levels of military command. Some called Kethvar a hero for sharing his knowledge. Others whispered that he was traumatized, unreliable, telling tales too terrible to be true. Kethvar no longer cared what they called him. The nightmares came every night now, vivid dreams of burning ships and dying comrades. But the young soldiers needed to hear the truth, all of it, even the parts that would haunt them forever. Tonight the crowd was larger than ever. Word had spread that Kethvar would tell the story of Procyon 7th, the battle that had broken the Dominion's will to fight. Even General Mortok had come, sitting quietly in the back corner where his rank insignia would not distract from the tale. You have heard about victories and defeats, Kethvar began, his voice hoarse from weeks of talking. You have heard about tactics and strategy. Tonight I will tell you about vengeance. The word hung in the air like a curse. Vengeance was not something civilized species practiced. Wars had rules, protocols, limits. Even conquest was supposed to be conducted with honor and restraint. Procyon 7 was our greatest triumph, Kethvar continued. A beautiful world with crystal seas and floating cities. 3 million humans lived there in peace, growing food and making art. We conquered it in 2 days with minimal casualties. The Zephyrian fleet had overwhelmed the planet's defenses easily. The humans had surrendered quickly, accepting occupation rather than see their cities destroyed. It had seemed like proof that the resistance movements elsewhere were aberrations. that most humans were reasonable beings who could be integrated into the Dominion. We were celebrating our victory when the Vengeance fleet arrived, Kethvar said quietly. The name still sent chills down his spine. Admiral John Carter had assembled what remained of the Earth Defense Force after the fall of Mars and Luna. It was not really a fleet in any traditional sense. Most of the ships were civilian vessels hastily converted for war, cargo haulers and passenger liners fitted with weapon systems that violated several galactic treaties. Carter had lost everything, Kethvar explained. His home world, his family, his entire species' future. He was not fighting to win territory or resources. He was fighting to make sure we paid for what we had taken. The flagship was called the EFS Retribution, a massive cargo hauler that had been stripped of safety systems and armor to make room for more weapons. Captain Roy Phillips commanded the vessel with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Phillips had been an engineer before the war, designing solar collection arrays for peaceful purposes. But the Zephyrian bombardment of Mars had killed his wife and children, turning him into something darker than any soldier. He had spent months converting his ship into a flying weapon, removing life support redundancies and radiation shielding to install more guns. The Retribution was not built to survive battles, Kethvar said. It was built to take as many enemies as possible down with it. The Vengeance fleet had arrived without warning, dropping out of hyperspace directly above Procyon 7. The Zephyrian forces were scattered across the system, confident in their victory, unprepared for a counterattack. It should have been a simple matter to destroy the ragtag human force, but the humans were not interested in traditional naval combat. They had come to die, and they intended to make their deaths count. The first ship to attack was the EFS Liberty, Bell, Kethvar remembered. A passenger liner converted into a ramming vessel. Lieutenant Beth Taylor was at the helm. Taylor had been a commercial pilot before the war, ferrying tourists between Earth and the outer colonies, but she had volunteered for the suicide mission, loading her ship with explosives and aiming it at the largest Zephyrian dreadnought in the system. She sang as she died, Kethvar said, his voice barely a whisper. All the humans sang as they made their final runs. Some old song about their homeworld, about blue skies and freedom. The Liberty Bell had crashed into the dreadnought's bridge, taking both ships down in a fusion fire that lit up the entire system. But that was only the beginning. Ship after ship followed Taylor's example, turning themselves into guided missiles aimed at the heart of the Zephyrian fleet. We could not stop them, Kethvar said. Every time we destroyed one ship, another took its place. They had no fear, no hesitation, no survival instinct at all. The humans revealed weapons they had been developing in secret, devices that made the Zephyrian military scientists weep with horror, gravitational bombs that collapsed entire ships into singularities, viral programs that turned enemy computers against their own systems, something they called nanoswarm weapons that could eat through hull metal like acid. But the worst were the Star Killers. We did not even know such things were possible, Kethvar said. Weapons that could destabilize stellar cores, turn suns into supernovas. The humans had built devices that could murder entire solar systems. Captain Phillips had activated one of these weapons during the battle, threatening to destroy the Procyon system's star if the Zephyrian fleet did not withdraw. It was a bluff that should have been ignored. No sane being would actually trigger such a device. But Phillips was no longer sane. The loss of his family had driven him beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond any consideration for his own survival or the survival of others. He gave us 10 minutes to retreat, Kethvar said. 10 minutes to abandon the system or watch 3 billion humans die along with our entire fleet. The Zephyrian admiral had refused to believe the threat was real. Destroying a star would kill everyone in the system, including the humans themselves. It was suicide on a scale that defied comprehension, but Phillips had been beyond caring about consequences. He had watched his children burn in the orbital bombardment of Mars. He had seen his wife's body in the wreckage of their home. The pain had consumed everything else, leaving only the need to make his enemies suffer as he had suffered. The star began to die, Kethvar whispered. We watched it happen on our sensors, saw the fusion reaction becoming unstable. Phillips was actually doing it. He was killing the sun. The retreat had been chaos, ships fleeing in all directions, desperate to reach minimum safe distance before the star exploded. But the humans had not been content to simply destroy the system. They had used the panic to launch one final assault. Carter's remaining ships followed us as we ran, Kethvar said. They had nothing left to lose, so they spent their lives like currency, buying destruction with their deaths. The EFS Retribution had been the last to die, ramming itself into the Zephyrian command ship as the star began its final collapse. Phillips had timed it perfectly, ensuring that his enemies would die with him in the expanding wave of stellar fire. 80% of our fleet was destroyed, Kethvar said. 3 entire battle groups gone in a matter of hours. And for what? The humans gained nothing. They saved no one. They simply chose to die rather than accept defeat. But they had achieved something more important than victory. They had sent a message to the galaxy, a demonstration of what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond all limits. We learned that day what extinction looks like, Kethvar said. Not just death, but the complete willingness to drag your enemies into oblivion with you. The humans had weaponized their own extinction. General Mortak stood up slowly, his face pale with understanding. He had been planning his own campaign against human space, confident that superior numbers and technology would ensure victory. Now he was not so sure. How do you fight an enemy like that? One of the recruits asked. Kethvar looked at the young soldier with tired eyes. You do not, he said simply. You negotiate, you compromise, you find another way. The cantina fell, silent as the implications sank in. The mighty Zephyrian Dominion, conqueror of worlds, master of the galaxy, had been stopped by a species that was willing to die rather than submit. Remember Procyon 7, Kethvar said as he stood to leave. Remember what happens when you push humans beyond hope. They do not just fight wars, they fight extinctions, and sometimes extinction wins. The old veteran walked out into the night, leaving behind a room full of soldiers who would never again underestimate the power of desperation. The cantina was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the entire military base that tonight would be Kethvar's final story. Officers from every branch of service had come to hear how the war with humanity had ended. Some stood against the walls, others crowded around small tables, all of them waiting to learn the truth about the Terran armistice. Kethvar looked older than ever. 4 weeks of reliving his worst memories had taken a visible toll. His scales had dulled further, and his hands shook constantly now. But his eyes were clear, focused with the intensity of someone who had one last important task to complete. You have heard about battles and defeats, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. You have heard about human weapons and human tactics. Tonight I will tell you how it all ended. He paused, looking around at the assembled soldiers. Many of them were taking notes, recording his words for future analysis. Others simply listened, trying to understand how the galaxy's greatest military power had been forced to negotiate with a species that seemed to have no concept of surrender. The final campaign was called Operation Exodus, Kethvar began. The humans were retreating toward the galactic rim, taking their remaining population with them. We thought we had won. We thought they were running away. The Dominion High Command had been confident that humanity was finished. Their homeworlds were occupied, their fleets destroyed, their colonies abandoned. The few million survivors were fleeing toward empty space, seeking refuge in the dark between stars. We should have let them go, Kethvar said quietly. We should have been grateful that they were leaving our space forever. But the High Command wanted total victory. They wanted to eliminate the human threat completely. Admiral Steve Hunter commanded the human evacuation fleet. Unlike the desperate warriors who had fought at Procyon 7, Hunter was calm, methodical, professional. He had been planning this moment for months, preparing for the final confrontation that would determine humanity's fate. Hunter sent a message to every major world in Dominion space. Kethvar continued. A simple broadcast that lasted only 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds changed everything. The message had been delivered simultaneously to hundreds of planets, broadcast on every communication frequency. Hunter's voice had been steady, almost conversational as he explained humanity's final position. "We are leaving," the human admiral had said. "We ask only that you let us go in peace. If you pursue us, if you threaten our civilians, we will defend ourselves, and our defense will be absolute." The threat had seemed hollow at first. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, fleeing with whatever ships they could salvage. What could they possibly do to threaten the vast dominion? "Then Hunter showed us the Star Killers," Kethvar said. The human colony ships had been armed with the same stellar destabilization weapons used at Procyon 7. But these were larger, more powerful, designed to trigger chain reactions that could destroy entire star clusters. The humans had turned their evacuation fleet into the largest weapon ever created. Every ship carried enough firepower to sterilize a dozen systems, Kethvar explained. Hunter promised to use them if we followed. He would turn the space between human territory and Dominion space into a graveyard of dead stars. The psychological impact was devastating. The humans were not just threatening to fight back. They were threatening to render vast regions of space uninhabitable for millions of years. It was warfare on a scale that made conquest meaningless. "The High Command ordered us to stop them anyway," Kethvar said. They believed Hunter was bluffing. No rational being would actually destroy so much life and territory. But the High Command had still not understood what they were fighting. Humanity had passed beyond rationality months ago. They were operating on pure survival instinct, willing to commit any atrocity to ensure their species continued to exist. The final battle had lasted only hours. The Dominion fleet caught up with the human convoy at the edge of known space, where the last stars faded into intergalactic darkness. It should have been a simple matter to destroy the fleeing ships and end the war, but Hunter had been ready. As the Zephyrian forces closed in, he began activating the Star Killers. One by one, the stars behind them began to die, creating an expanding wall of destruction that threatened to consume everything in its path. "We watched entire solar systems collapse," Kethvar remembered. "Billions of years of stellar evolution destroyed in minutes." Hunter was actually doing it. He was killing the galaxy piece by piece. The Dominion forces had found themselves trapped between the human fleet and the expanding zone of stellar death. They could not retreat without being consumed by the dying stars. They could not advance without facing the humans' remaining weapons. That was when the peace talks began, Kethvar said. Negotiator Rachel Murphy had represented humanity at the emergency sessions. She was not a military officer but a diplomat, someone who understood that victory was not always measured in destroyed ships and conquered worlds. Murphy's demands were simple, Kethvar continued. Complete withdrawal of all Dominion forces from human space, recognition of humanity's right to exist as an independent species, technology sharing to help rebuild the worlds we had destroyed. The terms should have been unacceptable. The Dominion had never negotiated with defeated enemies before. They conquered or they destroyed, but they did not compromise. But Murphy had made it clear that humanity was not defeated. They were simply choosing a different battlefield. If the war continued, they would take the entire galaxy down with them. The High Command agreed to everything, Kethvar said. Complete withdrawal, technology transfers, formal recognition. They signed documents that they had never imagined signing. The Terran armistice was not a peace treaty between equals. It was a surrender document signed by the galaxy's greatest military power, acknowledging that some wars could not be won through conventional means. We learned that day what total war really means, Kethvar said. Not just fighting until one side wins, but fighting until both sides lose everything. The humans had mastered the art of mutually assured destruction. But the real lesson was deeper than military strategy. The humans had proven that some species would rather face extinction than accept slavery. They had turned their own willingness to die into the ultimate weapon. They did not defeat us through superior technology or tactics, Kethvar explained. They defeated us by making the cost of victory too high to bear. Every battle, every death, every destroyed world served that purpose. The armistice had held for 3 years now. The humans were rebuilding their civilization in the dark spaces between galaxies, far from Dominion territory. They had kept their promise to leave peacefully, but they had also kept their other promise. They are still out there, Kethvar said, building new worlds, new fleets, new weapons, preparing for the next war that we all hope will never come. A young recruit raised his hand. Are they still dangerous? Kethvar looked at the soldier with tired eyes. More dangerous than ever. They have learned that they can defeat anyone by being willing to lose everything. That knowledge makes them the most terrifying force in the galaxy. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. But they have also kept their word. They leave us alone as long as we leave. Them alone. That is the real victory of the armistice. Peace through mutual terror. General Mortok stepped forward from the back of the room. What is your assessment of future human intentions? Kethvar considered the question carefully. They will never trust us again. They will never be defenseless again. But they will also never start a war. They have learned that survival is more important than conquest. The old veteran walked toward the door but paused before leaving. Remember this above all else. Humans do not fight wars to win territory or resources. They fight wars to ensure they never have to fight them again. When you understand that difference, you understand why the galaxy will never be the same. The cantina remained silent long after he left. The assembled officers sat with their thoughts, processing what they had learned about warfare, about humanity, and about the price of peace. Outside, the stars shone cold and distant, but everyone in the room knew that some of those stars might not be there tomorrow if the delicate balance of terror ever broke down. The humans had taught the galaxy a new kind of fear, and that fear would shape the future for generations to come.